And so the documentary series recently aired on PBS during Black History Month. How did you come up with this idea and what was the purpose?
So this was a project that Dr. Henry Louis Gates, who I may slip and refer to as Skip, which is his nickname. But Dr. Gates, as maybe some of your audience may know, has been working on a lot of documentaries about African American history for many years for PBS.
Yeah.
And this was a really personal subject that he had wanted to do for a very long time. After I think the success of his Reconstruction series, which came out several years ago, he wanted this to be that follow up to that series. And so, it was one of his most personal projects. He'd always wanted to do something on religion and faith and its role in Black resistance. And so the timing seemed right for us to take on this series. And for those who you have seen it, we actually started production before COVID, so that's one of the reasons why you see people hugging on each other, which is certainly not something we would have done during COVID. But so we started this series a couple of years ago in 2019.
Is Dr. Gates Christian?
He is, yes.
And are you a Christian as well?
I was raised Catholic, yes.
Oh, okay. And so this project, was it made by a Christian team?
I think most of the people affiliated with the project have some Christian faith in their backgrounds. So yeah, I would say that's fair.
It was interesting to see that you guys covered over 400 years of history. How long did it take to make that, to finish from beginning to end?
So yeah, 400 years is a lot of history to
Yeah.
cover, and so we started our initial pre-production research where we, spoke to a lot of scholars who we put together on a panel of advisors. And so we started that in, February of 2019 and went into production, which means, we're on the road with Dr. Gates and
Yeah.
our crew traveling all across the country, traveling to churches, big and small, rural, urban, north and south, for several months. And we finished production. So we finished editing just as the lockdown was happening in March of 2020. So I would say over, a year and change from start to finish, from research to, completion. And then it was held because we thought, it was originally slated to run in November of 2020, which, as we all know, was,
Yeah.
election year. And we didn't want the series to be overwhelmed by politics. And so we held it until February of 2021, which is why you're seeing it now.
And so you just happened to be walking down the road, and Dr. Gates was like, "Hey, Shayla,
Yeah,
come."
just tap me on the shoulder.
What?
uh, so I got involved because I had worked as a producer on Who Killed Malcolm X, which was a 6-part series that aired on Netflix and Fusion last year. And Dr. Gates was an executive producer of that series. So I became familiar to him through that. And when I had finished working on that, I had learned that they were starting production on the Black church. And as someone who grew up Catholic, I don't necessarily have a sort of traditional Black church background, but, I had obviously done a lot of documentaries and historical research on African American history and had always had an interest in religion. And so this
Right.
seemed like a really fascinating series to bring all of those interests together.
How much of this series is true, and how much is made up?
All of it's true. None of it's made up. None of it's made up.
And what time period does the series start and end?
So we were very interested in charting the role of religion and faith in the African American experience. And for us, that really started with the arrival of Africans to this shore. So that's from 1619, which is sort of when people sort of mark that first arrival of Africans to these shores into the present day. So 2019, which when we finished production. So 400 years from 1619 to 2019.
That's amazing. I noticed that in the series, it didn't mention that black people were sold by other blacks to the Arabs, and it was the Arabs who sold black around the world. Why was that left out?
For us, 4 hours seems like a lot of time to be able to tell this history. But as those of you who may have worked in this space know, that 4 hours is not a lot of time to talk about everything that we may want. So we didn't really necessarily have time to get into the history of enslavement and how the Africans came to this shore. We really wanted to start the story from their arrival in the Americas.
Right.
And so I think that's partly why we didn't delve into any of that.
Yeah, I had hoped to see that because a lot of black people think that, if not most, they think that it was the white people who went to Africa and bought the blacks and brought them here, and when it wasn't that. So I think if they had seen that, it would have cut out a little bit of the anger toward white people from the blacks.
Yeah, no, that story is a documentary onto itself.
Yeah.
About how all of that happened, for sure.
And you guys interview a lot of people in the series. People like Oprah, John Legend, Jennifer Hudson, T.D. Jakes, Kirk Franklin. Did they know a lot about the history of the black church? Why them instead of older generation?
Yeah, no, we wanted to have a cross section of people that we talked to. We have a number of scholars and theologians who we spoke to who have done a lot of research in the history of the Black church. And we also wanted to talk to clergy folks who covered a range of denominations and disciplines. And we also wanted to talk to, sort of notable Black people about their Black church experience, because I think although those folks may not seem like they have that background, they're certainly, their spirituality and their faith has informed a lot of their work in the public space. And so, that was fascinating to us that there's a lot of different ways of looking at the history of the Black church. That's not just through the spiritual lens of the folks who are working inside the church, but in terms of how it has affected the broader Black community. And so for us, those folks like Jennifer Hudson and Oprah and John Legend are sort of standing in for that like wider Black community.
Is John Legend a Christian?
Yes, I believe he was raised in the Pentecostal faith.
Oh, okay. I got you. And did you have a favorite moment in the documentary when you went, wow, that's amazing, I didn't know that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things are more personal. So for me, the most moving scene is the last scene that we show in the series, which is when we went back to the church that Dr. Gates was raised in West Virginia. That's a church that his family has attended for many, many decades. And so it was really moving for him to go back home to that church that, he's moved away since and has been living elsewhere. And so it was a sort of a prodigal son returning home to the church that had nurtured him. And it was really moving to, see his testimony and see how that community embraced him after he had been gone for such a long time. And to me, that represented sort of what the Black church means in these communities, that, even if you don't go every Sunday or you don't go all the time or you haven't seen those folks, that when you need them, that they're there. So that for me was a really beautiful moment. And, I hope people feel the same when they watch that in the series.
The one thing I noticed, and I think I've always known this, is that people in the South, I don't know how much today they're into it, they tend to take God and church a little more seriously than the people in the North or in, the big cities. Did you notice that at all?
I think it's hard to say categorically across the board. I think We did find that, some of the rural Black churches, had been there for generations. And so therefore people had a different relationship to those churches than some maybe newer churches that have emerged in recent years. But, I think by and large, all of the places that we went to and visited, I think had pretty robust congregations and people who were associated with it.
Yeah.
And, I think even now, I think there is a broad number of people who don't go to church regularly on Sundays, and there's like secularization, I think, across, not just Black people, but white people. But there still is a fair number of people who that is a very important part of their week is going to church.
So the series started during the time of slavery. What is the relationship between church and slaves? And the reason I ask that because when I was growing up, I grew up in Alabama on a plantation under the Jim Crow laws, and I didn't hear a lot about slavery. We heard about it, we talked about it a little bit, and Jim Crow. Even though I grew up under the Jim Crow, there was not a lot of talk about it. More about God, family, and the country. What is the relationship between the church and slaves?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask, and I think it depends on which community is asking that question. I mean, I think certainly from what we shared in the series, the white community, the community of people who had enslaved folks, didn't really talk about the faith of the enslaved persons, and used some notion that Black people were not spiritual people, did not come with faith to sort of justify that enslavement of people of color. And I think if you asked the Black community about the role of faith and if God was important to them, I think it was because it was a way of them navigating this period of unfreedom, that the faith that they saw and learned about and the stories that they learned about in the Bible helped them think about and understand that there could be a time when they would be free, that they would be liberated like the Israelites were in the Bible. And so I think you find that both communities sort of looked at this same book and looked at this same faith in very different ways. That's what I would say.
In the movie, I got the impression that the Blacks were more when they were praying about God or having church. It's in the movie, in the documentary, it seemed to be more about overcoming slavery than it was about having a relationship with God. Whereas when I was growing up, it was more about being a child of God, having a relationship with God, and He guiding your way and the family and all that. Am I seeing that wrong?
No, I don't necessarily see those as mutually exclusive. That I think that if you had been living under the period of slavery and you saw yourself as a child of God, the experience that you were having on that earth did not necessarily reflect that. So I think that certainly knowing God and having a direct relationship with God was something that was important to those enslaved Africans that we feature in the series. And a lot of them had come to the Americas with their own faith practices that they used to help them adapt the Christianity that they encountered here.
Right.
But certainly their day-to-day experiences of unfreedom had to be something that they reconciled with the faith that they were practicing.
Why did the Christians in the documentary seem so sad? And, when I was growing up, we wasn't as sad. We were like, we had joy, we had family, we worked, and we were under Jim Crow. My grandfather ran the plantation, his father ran it, and so on and so on. But I never experienced such sadness in the Blacks before. Why so much sadness?
I don't know if I thought that they were experiencing sadness. I think that my sense of, hearing spirituals and hymns and And some of the experiences that people had in the Hush Harbors were actually very transformative, and very emotional, for them to build community in those spaces. And so while they may have been somber about the experiences and the oppression that they faced, the fact that they were able to use this faith to create community with other people who looked like them and who saw the world in the same way that they did, I think really you can see reflected in, things like the spirituals, which I think are doing a couple things on the same level. They're transmitting messages and stories of pain, but also pride and hope and healing and all of those things at the same time, which was something that I felt I took away from.
Oh, okay.